Hello everyone, this is Gaurav Bhosle, ex-McKinsey consultant and career coach to top consultants and consulting aspirants across the globe. And welcome to Unfiltered, a podcast brought to you by Being Consultant, the world's biggest platform of problem solvers. In this particular podcast, we are trying to go very up close and personal with the best consulting mind across the globe to understand their insights about consulting career, their career journey, the kind of decision that they took which shaped their career so that we can crack the consulting career code from there. Our today's guest is Kriti Kakria, a prominent leader at London's People Transformation Practice. Kriti's career spans three regions: Asia, Middle East, and Europe. And Kriti has been working shoulder to shoulder with C-suites of some of the prominent organizations to design, carry out, and sustain some of the very critical and impactful transformations.
Thanks, Kriti. Thanks for being here on the Being Consultant podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. Quite excited to have this candid conversation on a Friday afternoon.
Great, great. And we'll get into the depth of consulting careers and all the topics related to consulting. But before we move there, why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey so far?
Yeah, let's do it. Um, it's a stereotypical journey in the sense of I'm an engineer by trade, did my MBA, moved into consulting, but then there are more unique nuances within that, or at least things that I would think are unique, right? I
Mhm.
started off as an engineer, studied in Singapore, worked in Singapore, and even during my engineering career days, I did a little on clean energy. I was a research engineer, so I was focusing on how to build energy efficient building facades. Soon enough, I realized maybe research is not what I want to do, and I wanted to move into hardcore industry. And I moved into industrial automation. I used to work with an American firm based out of Singapore. We were what it's called in that world as the independent system integrators. So basically, we were people who would automate things for clients, and clients could be anyone from various organizations within manufacturing, shipping, logistics, etc. And we would end up using systems that are created by companies like Siemens, Rockwell, ABB, etc. Right? So
Mhm.
I was quite literally on the shop floor for companies like Abbott, MSD, Novartis, etc., writing ladder logic, running the commissioning work for them, testing everything before handing over into a full-fledged stage. So the quintessential yellow boots, yellow hat, all of that, right?
Hardcore engineering kind of a work, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And as luck would have it, because I was in Singapore, a lot of what happens in Singapore, typically your friend circle ends up being a lot from the financial sector or the consulting sector. That's just how the GDP there works, right? So you meet friends and then you talk to them, and you just come out of university. If the world is really new, you're doing something and you're very curious about knowing what your friends are doing, right? And you hear from investment bankers, you hear from consultants, and a few of my friends back then were in Bain and BCG. They were recruited as graduates, and I kept asking them, "No, what is it that you do?" I could understand a little bit of what investment bankers do, but I couldn't, for the life of me, understand what management consultants do. Especially because when you describe it, it just sounds very high level faff, right? And I was like,
Right.
okay, what is it? And that sort of ignited my curiosity, right? On a regular basis, every time we would meet, I would keep talking about it. I noticed they were traveling around a lot, so I noticed there's a lot of variety in what they do, right? And every time I was not getting similar answers from even from the same person. Every 2 3 weeks it would be a very different answer in terms of what they did. And that sort of made me very curious because I generally am someone who thrives on a bit of variety, difference. I don't like 2 days being the exact same, right? So and I was like, this sounds pretty cool, let's explore it. Started speaking to people and I was like, maybe I want to do this, but the problem was, how do I shift into this, right? I was in a hardcore engineering world, much vastly different from how it is to be in a management consulting organization. And that's when the need for an MBA sort of arose, right? And I wanted to make that classical shift across industry as well as across my role. So I moved on, went to the University of Hong Kong, and there was a partnership program in London Business School. So I did that. It was a short 1 year program, full time, very intense because it was 1 year. But the good thing was that program was full of people whose average professional tenure had been at least 4 to 7 years, right? So the classroom was
Okay.
very enriched with people who bring in a lot of different insights and from different parts of the world, right? So that really added to it. In HKU and LBS, both typically teach in the case study methodology. So that sort of became very interesting. That's one of the reasons I picked these two schools apart from Richard Ivy as well. So I was like, okay, this will help me bring in that rigor that's required from a case consulting sort of setup. Started So did that for a year, was very exciting. Every week I remember there were 5 cases to read and then go back, think about it, question, figure what could it be. And the most beautiful part of it for me was there's never a right answer in consulting, right? It's about we joke about it, the classical consulting answer is it depends, right? But that is just so true. As you become a consultant, you realize there's no one size fits all, right? So did that. And then apart from doing an industry role shift, I also needed to do a geography shift for personal reasons. I wanted to move out of Hong Kong slash London and move back to India. And this was going to be my first job in India, because before this I'd worked only in Singapore. So we call it the three-dimensional shift after an MBA. It was quite a struggle, to say the least. It's in a market like India where good talent is available in plenty. There are amazing B schools. Entering that market is quite challenging, especially in consulting, right? Because consulting is also one of the top three options for people who graduate out of these pedigree schools in India. I started looking at firms, of course, the MBBs of the world, started looking at Big Fours just to diversify, because also Big Fours did a little more operational work, which I thought I could add a lot more value to, because I had been on the shop floor, for example. And then I started looking at these niche firms like there was Mercer, Towers Watson, Conferry, etc. And back then, Conferry was known as Hay Group. And it was quite exciting that then leadership there was doing a very different kind of people consulting. A lot of us are very confused about people consulting to say, oh, it's just all of the softer stuff, all of the easier stuff. But the more and more I started studying about what they were doing, the more I started networking in those circles, I realized there is a lot of strategy that's built by the MBBs, the high level vision, mission, etc. is created. But the deep activation of it sits a lot with people slash org consulting or org and workforce transformation consulting. The words keep changing across geographies, but this is largely the gamut, or workforce advisory, for example. So it was quite exciting to see that there are certain things which could make or break a very good strategy, right? You could have a very good mission on paper, vision on paper, but to activate it, to deploy it, to bring it to life, really, right? And went through a few about nearly 4 or 5 rounds of interviews with Hay Group. And I remember you and I have talked about it. There was a grueling BEI, which is a behavioral event interview. And I think that in retrospect, I kept thinking, and I was just entering as a consultant. So their ladder started with analyst and then consultant. So for all practical purposes, I was at a lateral level because I came from a B school, but because I didn't have a consulting background. So I think the thing that they were trying to assess in that BEI was the transferable skills, right? And not so much technical, more behavioral, right? Things like how do you deal with ambiguity? Because that's a classic in consulting. Uh, there we talk a lot about problem solving in consulting, but it's very ambiguous problems that clients give us, right? They don't come to us and say, oh, can you prepare my market entry strategy? It's never as simple as that, right? They think about, we want to look at expansion, want to look at product portfolio, we want to, or sometimes it's as abstract as, decision making is so slow in our country, in our company. Can we do something to make ourselves less bureaucratic and more efficient? And what do you do as a consultant, right? It could mean 100 things to 100 different people, depending on how you interpret it. They ran a very detailed PEI. I remember there were multiple questions around how I behave, how I react to things, how I feel. So a lot of emphasis was also put on how I react, how I feel in that situation. Right? Am I calm? Do I feel disgruntled? Various situations that they put across, which was quite fascinating. And I don't think I quite understood its value back then because I was just entering consulting. But now, as I reflect back, and the colleague who then took my interview, we worked very closely for years later, and we are still very good friends. And we talk about it in terms of how I presented certain aspects, which though came from core engineering world, but they were very very relevant, right, to consulting. And I think that really is a big black box for a lot of people who want to move to consulting, including me, right? Like when I wanted to move, I didn't know how do I build that, right? I just knew I needed an MBA to at least build something. But as we know, as the world is evolving, maybe MBA is not the answer. Maybe there are other things, right? So it's all about finding those transferable skills, applying them in the relevant context.
Mm.
So yeah, so I moved on to Hay Group. Got acquired by Conferry within 3 months of my joining. The really amazing team that I was working with, they sort of moved on to Deloitte, and I wanted to stay on because it was really my first job in consulting. So I thought I'll stick it out. And it was a it was a crash landing, if you could call it that, very much. Business was a little slow because there was a rebranding of the entire after the entire acquisition. Leadership teams were changing, a lot of attrition, etc. But that sort of offered me a very interesting opportunity. Suddenly, I noticed, like, I was on my first engagement, and the engagement manager, quit the organization, and I was elevated. This is my second engagement, and I'm suddenly an engagement manager. And it comes with its pluses and minuses, I suppose, high risk, high reward kind of situations. But it did make me learn a lot in a very small duration, I would say. And luckily, and I'm glad that, and maybe at some point we'll talk about this as well. I'm glad I started this my career in India, because in India consulting is not very siloed, and especially people consulting or workforce consulting, you're expected to know a lot about the entire gamut of services. And as you sort of become more senior, you could pick few areas. But even though you pick few areas, you would end up working in the other areas. You could lean on SMEs, SMRs, but you still have the entire ownership. So I think Conferry gave me that really good confidence that I could deal with a lot of things across people consulting. There are the slightly more abstract concepts around leadership competencies. Then there are the more aged concepts around org structure, workforce planning, job sizing, etc. I'm just glad I got that opportunity because I could really appreciate the entire gamut. I
Mm.
spent just about 5 years with Conferry, did a whole lot of work across the entire gamut. I very interestingly, I'd come from a pharma world from my engineering days, and my first project in Conferry was in a pharma organization based out of Ahmedabad in India. And that sort of helped me a lot, right? It gave me, I felt, you think things will not give you a jump start, but that was quite a jump start for me because I was suddenly back on the shop floor. I remember having a conversation with a chief quality officer of that, and it's a very large organization based in India. And they were talking about something, and I used some acronyms like GMP, good manufacturing practices, or something to that tune. And they're like, oh, how do you know it? Because they don't typically expect consultants to know a lot about the deeper details, right? Unless you're a
Right. Right.
unless you're a sectoral expert, and which I wasn't because I was just starting off. So that really helped. That helped me understand how the roles are designed in the organization, and that assignment really was around role design and career pathing. So to be able to appreciate role design and career pathing, I needed to understand the value chain of the business, right? And I think because I worked in the manufacturing and specifically in the pharmaceutical sector, it really gave me a one up. My learning curve, at least on the developing an understanding of the sector, wasn't very tough. Developing an understanding of the solution areas was definitely very tough.
Mhm.
So I did a whole lot of stuff around manufacturing, or yeah, industrial manufacturing, however you may call it. And I think it was probably at the 3 or 4 year mark, I thought as a development area, I want to sort of expand to another sector because manufacturing, while it's good, but I also want to sort of future proof myself, right, in terms of skills and make myself more relevant. And that's how I came across the financial services sector.
Mm.
I specifically picked that for two reasons, right? One was my MBA was in strategy and finance, so I thought I understand the theory around it, so it'll be just a little easier for me to appear
Mm.
smarter in front of clients. Two, we also had a very big client. It was a marquee client in Conferry, and I knew that they were looking for succession for an account manager for that role. And I thought maybe if I position all of this well, I could sort of be that account manager role where I service a
Mm.
client for all of their needs, not just needs across my specialty areas, right? So picked up financial services. That was a steep learning curve from a sectoral understanding because very different from manufacturing. Manufacturing, you can see and feel things, whereas FS is like it's all abstract, all in the air, right?
Or
Um,
the
um,
Excel.
Sorry.
Or in the Excel.
Or in the oh yeah, those excels and the models and power BIs and whatnot, right? So did that, and at that point is when I came across a pivotal project in my career. It was one of the largest general insurance merger deal that was happening in India between two firms, and Conferry had partnered with EY Parthenon back then. So EY Parthenon were running the overall business integration, and Conferry was running the people and culture integration. It was nearly a 1 year long project that started at the peak of the pandemic, so it was in 2020. It was quite a case study for us internally in Conferry as well, because this was the first time we delivered a project fully virtual, because the world before this for consultants was very standard in India. On a Tuesday morning, you head to the airport. On a Thursday night, you're dragging a stroller back home, and then Friday you work from home, and that's just how it is, right? You're every weekend you're just preparing your suitcase, and that was just the life. And sometimes, because in India your clients are very spread across, sometimes you end up doing two cities in the same week. So you
Mm.
could be in a. It's funny. Like I remember when I was pregnant, I was doing trips in 1 week to Bangalore, then to Ahmedabad and whatnot, right? And,
Wow.
and it's very fascinating. So yeah, at the peak of the pandemic, we delivered this project fully virtual. None of us ever imagined in our craziest, wildest of thoughts that we could do something fully virtual like this. We were holding CEO conversations, board conversations. And by this time, I was at a 4+ year juncture. I had understood a lot around org structure, workforce planning, and I was very excited by all of those bits. And when this project came about in my head, I was like, oh, okay, this I could really do it because I've done it a few times. How tough could it be? And I was terribly wrong about that, because when you come into an M&A setup, it's a very different thing. While you're doing the same solution around org structure or anything else, but the concept and the everything is time boxed, right? There is a legal day one, there is an operational day one, there is everything around unlocking value for the stakeholder, right? Because that's the reason why a lot of these M&A deals are happening. So
Right.
theoretically you are unlocking something when a bigger player in the market takes up a smaller player in the market. But what does it mean, right? From actually, how do people work? On legal day one, who would be simple things, right? People were like, these in these organizations, people were asking their reporting managers, sir, who am I going to report to? Who will be my new boss? Do I get to work in the same office, for example, right? Because that's a simple thing. Do you change your chair? Or do you change to a different building? How does it go? So a lot around that in terms of how people would be structured, what teams would need to be upskilled in terms of technology, in terms of ways of working.
Mm.
Where would the cost synergies come out? Because a lot of times it's not a 1 + 1 = 2 with M&A deals. There's also a lot of synergies that leadership teams typically like to take out. Those could be typically cost synergies coming from different angles, right? And one of the biggest angle is people cost, wage cost. How do you do that? How do you manage it sensitively? Because it is just something that touches people on a regular basis, right? Did that, and that's when I for the first time had seen what scale could look like, because Conferry was a very niche organization, so we did very interesting, insightful work, but those would be a little narrow in terms of its scope. And here we had like 6 work streams running. There would be work stream alignment calls every week. And I'm like, my God, this is like 5 projects running together. And there are interlocks, there are interdependencies. You cannot move unless someone else has finished something. And you are going to impact someone else's outputs, etc. And that sort of opened my eyes to a whole different level of complexity which came with scale.
Mm.
And the more I spoke to people were like, yeah, this is what big fours really do on a regular basis. And I was like, oh wow,
Mm.
this sounds interesting, and maybe I want to sort of get that in my professional experience now. And that's how the move to Deloitte India happened. I was there for a year. One of the toughest years, I would say, from a learning standpoint. I learned a whole lot of taking back as well, because, and I say that because Big Fours work very differently. Big Fours are a very different animal, right? Very large teams, very diverse teams. Project sizes, average ticket size is much higher.
Mm.
I was also trying to build up another area of people consulting that I'd never picked up in Conferry, which was around performance management systems. And incidentally, both my first project, my first and the second project in Deloitte were performance management systems in the cement industry for two Indian-owned organizations. And it was such a good compare and contrast. They were in the same sectors. We were doing the same performance management system work, but they were on two extremes, right? Like, for example, one of them was still talking about concepts around we want a balanced scorecard for our senior leadership, we want shared goals to drive company value, etc. Whereas the other one was going all forward with things like we don't want a bell curve, we want instant rating, and we want from a 5 point rating scale we want to drop to 4, we want to have OKR suddenly. And it was such a nice spectrum to learn as well. I had some really good leaders who sort of taught me how to navigate the two really contrasting organizations, right? Did that, and then after that, I was staffed on a project in Dubai, which was for a bank based out of Abu Dhabi, and they were running a very large scale transformation only for the IT function. And just
Mm.
to give you a sense of the scale, the IT function was 2,100 FTE, full time employees.
Wow.
As a large scale. So it was a very large bank, and they were running a transformation where Deloitte was supporting them across different spectrums. And the piece of work that I was doing was around workforce strategy again. So to say, how do you need to be structured? What is the right number of simple things? How many architects do we need? How do we justify? How many developers do we need? What chunk of our population needs to be offshored, onshored? What chunk
Mm.
of our work could be a managed service, right? Where can we give it to vendors who could do it for us at a cheaper rate than
Yeah.
having to do it somewhere else? Did that was and this was post pandemic. This was 22, so it was in and out again, flights back and forth every time. Just that from domestic flight, it got upgraded to international flights. But yeah, that was a very exciting project, and that sort of it reminded me of I'd already lived before I moved back to India. Before I joined consulting, I had lived abroad for 9 years, and I was very used to working in diverse teams from a standpoint of different citizenships, etc. When I went for this project, the project in Dubai, the same thing, right? I remember at one point we had some 20 nationalities in one room discussing. Like we had an offsite kind of a meetup
Mm.
where we were planning for the next quarter and everything. And I was like, wow, this is so fascinating. As diverse as India is, as it provides you, because let's accept it, India doesn't operate as one country. For the rest of the world it does. But if for all of us Indians who've lived there, we all know how diverse each place could be, right?
Almost like a Europe, right? So,
Yeah, absolutely, right. So I was like, now I've been abroad. I came back to India. I appreciated a lot of diversity, a lot of ways in which management consulting worked, and I said maybe now I want to sort of look at going back abroad. And it was also sort of personally, it was at a moment in life where we were wondering how do we now fare in the global world, right? We'd been in Me and my partner, we'd been in India for a while, and it was a time
mm.
where we were like, okay, maybe it's a good time to move. Personally as well, it worked well because we had a child. He was 3.5 by then, so he was past the age of needing support from grandparents and everything. And we were like, maybe now it's easier to move abroad, right? Otherwise,
Also
child
school,
can.
probably entering the school time. So, perfect.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, and we were spoiled for all the support we had from family, friends in India, and we were like, how, and you need a lot of that as a working mother in consulting. I remember a lot of my
Okay.
uh, a lot of my junior colleagues who were women, and by the time I'd already delivered and I was back at work, and they were like, how do you do it, how do you manage it, it's so amazing. And I was like, I can only do it because I have a massive support system at home, right? And
Wondering when you said you are flying to Dubai or Abu Dhabi for a project with kid at home.
yeah, it is quite tough, and there is a classic mom guilt around, do you
Ah,
stay at home, do you see the milestones, or do you also achieve your own milestones professionally, right? But it's a balance. My partner is in consulting as well, so both of us
okay.
understand the occupational hazards that come with it. So our week
Yeah.
even now is all around planning each other's diaries, who's going to do the school runs, who's going to go for that function at school, and all of that. So it's a constant diary management, I think, once you become a consultant. So
Yeah.
yeah. Sorry, where were we? Yeah, we were talking about, oh yeah, the move to the UK. So yeah, at that point, that exposure in Dubai sort of triggered that nerve again, right? To say, let's see if we can, where do we fit in the global world again? And we bring a lot of rich experience from India in terms of clients, in terms of areas of work, in terms of the firms that I worked with as well. And EY happened very by chance. A friend used to work here. She referred me. I went through a couple of assessment centers. They're called assessment centers, mass recruitment, where they call in a lot of people. They do two
Correct.
rounds. So I remember I had a behavioral interview with the director. Then I had a case study round with the director and a peer to assess, like, if I'm thinking the right way. And after that, there was a final round with a very senior partner, which is more to assess culture fitment, which is quite an interesting concept I learned here, which is more in the European part of the world, which I hadn't seen in India or in Dubai. They are very particular about cultural fitment in terms of how do you work, your ways of working, about bringing your whole self to work, right? And by then I was already a mother. I was very vocal about having flexible hours, because that's just how everyone knows consulting is not the most appreciated career when it comes to work life balance. But if you want to make it work for yourself, you have to manage your life around it, right? So
True.
I heavily rely on the flexibility that consulting provides me. And it's
Mhm.
quite interesting, right? Some days, some projects, all of us would have clocked 12 hours, 15 hours in a day. And there are weeks where you're doing that. There's a steer code that's coming up, and you're probably working day in and day out on a specific deck, on a specific Excel analysis, whatnot. And then there's some downtime as well. Sometimes things are a little slow, and you figure, as you sort of become more seasoned in consulting, you figure when that's going to come, and you sort of plan your life a little around it, right?
Right.
So, yeah,
Because he's an
like,
he's an investor in the market, right? So it
yeah.
there is going to be downturn, but there's also going to be upswing, right? So
Yeah, and then this time on the bench, you appreciate that time a lot more, right? Once you've been through really tough, crazy projects. In India, typically, you would not have that much time on bench as you keep moving up the ladder, because you end up doing two, three things at the same time. So
right.
it's just that one project would dial down, another would pick up, and it's like that. But here in the UK, at least in EY, for me, it's more like I stay on a specific project, I close it, then I move on to something else, right? It's a logical closure for anything, and you're doing something full time. Yeah, so I think consulting, one big fear that a lot of people and a lot of our friends who are not in consulting, and they're like, oh, you must work crazy hours. Yeah, we do, but then it sort of, I feel it on, in general, it sort of evens out, because you have your downtime, you have your easy days, or you just learn to manage around it, right? I'm sort of now used to doing a school run in between, going for
Mm.
a quick grocery run if it's needed, if that's the most urgent thing. You just plan your life around it. And in Europe, specifically, of course, within Europe, of course, management consulting would be slightly more challenging from a work-life balance standpoint. But compared to India, compared to Asia, it's a lot better, this part of the world. um,
Mhm.
yeah, so we moved here. We've been here nearly 2+ years, almost clocking a 3 year mark here. Again, I'm in the workforce transformation slash workforce optimization, whatever you call it, the different terms. That's what I do here. I focus a lot on financial services clients. I also do, because I was doing a lot of manufacturing related stuff, I energy and utilities was a little adjacent as well. So power generation, distribution, etc. So I ended up doing a fair bit of that. I do that here as well. In the last 1 year, I've heavily focused myself on transformation. So I have done more projects for clients where they're large scale transformations that they are running, and more than just design, which is usually where consultants come in. I'm also sticking around during the implementation phase, which is a classic criticism that a lot of consulting firms get, right? That we come in during the design state and we step out and that's it. We don't have a skin in the game. But in the last 3 4 years, a lot of that has changed. Simple things, right? Even from a contracting perspective, the way our contracts are worded has changed now as well across firms, right? It's an industry wide trend where we sort of go out to the client and say, if we are able to generate these savings, efficiencies, etc., we sort of get a 1% on your savings or something, right? So there's a skin in the game, and yeah.
Implementation, capability building, all these things have now been part of projects, and gone are the days when you just tell them strategy and go away.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this part of the world, change management with any new thing you're doing, any transformation you're doing is very, very important. This part of the world really looks for, they really reach out to consultants to support them in the entire change management aspect. How do we run the messaging? How do we sort of implement it in the least disruptive way, right? So quite interesting.
Mm. Cool. That's very fascinating. Your journey. So a couple of points. I was just taking notes while you were taking us through your journey. Here on the one of the previous conversation, you spoke about. Uh, I think during childhood as well, you moved, right?
Yes.
States or countries to country. So tell us a little bit more about that. And did that also help, given that you have worked in so many different markets, so many different geographies, and of course, your progress always has been on the upward side, though the markets have changed, companies have changed. So, what you think uh, some of these upbringing things also add value?
I absolutely think so. I'm also a very biased army brat, so take it with a pinch of salt. And yes, I've lived across a few cities. I wouldn't even classify a lot of them as cities. Those are very tiny towns where army camps are established in India. I studied across about 10, 12 odd schools, and I joke about this. I didn't have to move to these many schools because I was a bad student. It's only because my dad decided to get posted every few years, and then you move, and sometimes you move in the middle of the academic year as well, right? And I
Mhm.
remember in India, the cycle for CBSE then used to be April to March, and sometimes I would move to a new school in November, which is like the fag end of the academic year. And apart from just getting used to a new school, new friends, new teachers, having to prove yourself, a lot of times it also happened where you moved to regions where you don't even speak the local language, right? I remember, like, so I hail from the northern part of the country, so Hindi comes naturally to me. But yeah, my dad had gotten posted to Chennai, and suddenly you only speak English there, and oh, there is Tamil if you can learn, and I struggled a bit, but you just find a way, and places grow on you. And today, if Chennai is like second home to me now, right? I prefer more of the eating habits from there than I would have had from my own native place and things like that. So I think that forced agility, if I could call it so, because it wasn't out of choice that I was made to be this, that I was this agile. I was made to be this agile because of the situation. I also call myself a situational nomad sometimes. So I I did that, and I think that does give you an appreciation for changing context, I think. And which, if you look at consulting, that happens to us every few months. You get onto
Absolutely.
a you get into a new project, and even before project, during BD stage, right? There's a certain value that consultants add during a project stage, but even during a business development stage, when you're proposing, when you're going for these lots of these conversations, appreciating the client's context, I think that it sort of helps me personally to think that people could come from very, very different backgrounds, and similarly organizations could come from very different starting points, could have very different goals in mind, and it's perfectly fine, right? Everyone could exist in a balance in the in the world today. So yeah, I definitely think my upbringing and my ability to move across places, schools, etc., helps me appreciate consulting a lot more, I would think.
Hmm. So that empathy element was like probably drilled into you very early.
Yeah. Yeah.
No wonder you are working in the change management space so much. Yeah. So you have to do change management yourself probably throughout the life.
Oh yeah, I like that statement. I'm going to use that, right? So my life has been all about change management.
Great. You spoke about HKU MBA and
Mm.
probably leveraging the MBA for this career transition. Yeah, that is where actually we met, right?
Yes.
HQ in 2016. So, what's your opinion about people trying to get into MBA for transitioning into consulting? Do you think it's still relevant? Is it still a good idea?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I briefly mentioned this earlier. I needed to desperately do it because I wanted to move the shifts from a location perspective, from a from a work area perspective. But I definitely feel in the last 1 2 years, MBA is becoming a little less relevant for a variety of reasons. Not just for consulting; it's for a lot of jobs. Actually, if you look at it, AI is disrupting world as we speak, Gaurav. So a lot of these skills that we learned in MBA schools, etc., can easily be taught now, or a bot can sort of do it for you today, right? You don't need to necessarily upskill yourself, particularly in that area. The cost associated with an MBA, it is always, and there's an opportunity cost of time. I was already working. And one reason for doing a 1 year MBA was because I didn't want to lose salary for 2 years, right?
Absolutely, this is opportunity
And
cost. Hmm.
yeah, and any good MBA today costs you quite a bit. So what is that balance, right? The other bit is I feel the way, not just consulting, even if you look at professional, even if you look at financial services, you look at the tech companies, etc., the way companies have been impacted by AI, a lot of value, a lot of tangible value that the MBA provided you, I think it's fading. So either the MBA is going to change in a way we've not seen before. I'm sure that program will evolve as well, or it'll just become something like a regular masters where you could do it if you want to study deeper into something. For example, you want to learn little bit more about branding, networking, branding, marketing, etc. The one positive for MBA, which I don't think has an alternate today, is the networking bit. And I think that's the most underrated, or maybe it is also overrated. The reason people go to a lot of these Ivy schools is not because the Ivy schools are teaching you something vastly different. It's that network, the higher value network that you create, right? And I think in consulting, that is important because as you grow in consulting, you reach a partner level, even in the levels, once you become a manager, senior manager, you have BD goals, right? You're not expected to
Hmm.
generate a lead from you're not cold calling. Okay, that's not what consulting is. You're not selling
Right.
credit cards, it's not cold calling, but you are building on your relationships. So if you've been to a school where you've been through that good network, there's a likelihood that you will end up selling to your classmates who become CEOs or who are in the CXO bracket within other companies, right? So I
Hmm.
think there is a value in that, on building that network, and specifically for consulting. And I've seen this across, right? You end up knowing someone, or because you went to the same school, or they know someone, and then you're like, oh, can we talk about a solution that we offer? Maybe it's going to be helpful to you. So these networks are very, very important globally.
Hmm. Interesting. Hmm. One of the word that really resonated with me when you were talking about uh, people consulting, or consulting that which is your specialization, is this people activation, right? So, of course, as a first phase of any strategic initiative, we come up with a strategy and then probably a little bit of implementation. But ultimately, um, people need to get activated, right? For any initiative to really add value to the company,
Yeah,
right? And that's the element the people consulting brings kind of to the table. Uh,
yeah.
can you spend a couple of minutes to tell us a little bit deeper in terms of what all types of projects generally fall into this org consulting or people consulting?
Absolutely. It reminds me of an anecdote from one of my early projects. It was for energy generation and distribution organization. It
Mhm.
was for a promoter-driven organization in India, or a family-owned business. They're also called promoter-driven organizations. And I remember the owner, who's the head of the family as well, right? We walk in and we're showing him a fancy presentation around the trends in the energy sector and all of the usual stuff any good consultant would do. And he's like, yeah, all of this is perfectly fine. But you know what? I want to sell electricity like toothpaste is sold in India today. And
Mhm.
it was such a crazy thought in my head. And I'm like, you are talking about electricity, which is a highly regulated service across the globe, and you're
Mhm.
talking about Colgate, which is like toothpaste, which is not regulated. It's a fast-moving consumer good. Like anyone could get it from the local local mom and pop shop, right? And when he said that, right, because this was my first of the few projects, and I'm like, what does it mean? What do we do? We can't change regulations. We can't say that electricity needn't be regulated. There came the activation bit, right? I think what he was trying to say is, how can I make my people operate that they want to sell electricity competitively? How do you do that? You need to look at your costs. You need to understand how you generate today. What is your mix for your generation?
Mhm.
How are your decisions being made in the organization? What is the process flow looking right? And once you
Mhm.
establish a process flow, what roles are focusing on which parts of the process? How should the roles and responsibilities be laid out? How does the handshake between different roles work out, right? So that really is that activation bit, right? So it,
Mhm.
it's it's the downstream reality on how you sort of bring things to life. And so this was, so as I remember, it's been so many years, but I'm like, how can you sell electricity like Colgate toothpaste, right? So this was one of the projects that was quite interesting. We spoke a lot about the M&A project that had a fair bit of complexity because of the associated costs, etc. So one of these interesting projects was very recently in the last 2 years in the UK. We were working for a financial services organization, one that was bootstrapped, one that was run by a PE firm. So there was a lot of emphasis around efficiencies, cost, decision making, and being very agile in ways of working. And we were sort of brought on to support their IT function, in specific IT and product function, so which was headed by a CPTO, which stands for Chief Product and Technology Officer.
Mhm.
And the way the CPTO had interpreted the strategy, which was pegged around being more product led. So they felt that their products are the ones which will distinguish them in the market compared to their competitors, right? And the way the CPTO interpreted it was that we want to move from a waterfall way of working to more agile ways of working, right? So all tech delivery had to happen in an agile way of working. So there, this and everyone, agile has been a buzzword in the market for quite some time now, and everyone loves to talk about it. There's scrums of scrums, there's retrospective, so much around there, right? And from a strategy point of view, but what does it mean from, when the rubber hits the road? What is it that you want to change, really, right? So we supported them with three work streams. One was more around product strategy on what should the product portfolio look like, because they'd grown in both organic and inorganic ways, so they had a lot of synergy to look for across their entire product portfolio. So a part of the team was doing that. A part of the team was doing more things around the target operating model, right? And that's where a lot of people, all kind of stuff sort of starts to come in. An operating model, as explained, is typically just how we organize ourselves, right? And I love this classic example, and it's very easy to understand when we think of fast moving consumer goods. Now, some companies like Nestle, for example, are structured in a more geographical sense, right? So there's an India P&L, there could be a Switzerland P&L, there's a Singapore P&L, and any product within that is within that P&L. Whereas, for example, a Unilever is more product-led P&L, right? So they're
Yeah.
organized is around their products. So that's a classic differentiation of an. That's what we mean by operating model. How do we go to market? What is our organizing way, right? Do we go to market taking a product, or do we attack geographies because we think any product within that geography would be attacked in the same way? And it could be, there are different ways. There's also a mix of these. In some cases, in the oil and gas sector, for example, the operating model or the organizing ways could be around upstream, midstream, downstream, etc. Right? So it's different industries, and even within the same industry, there is no standard template, right? So we were supporting them with building the target operating model. How do we organize? And remember, Gaurav, when we say an operating model, it's not necessarily the organization structure, which is the lines and the boxes. This is more front facing, more outward facing, more client facing, right? How do you organize yourself? How does the governance look like, right? Because if you want to deliver in a waterfall methodology, you need to have governance checkpoints. Who would
Right.
be the representatives? Where would be they be sitting, right? And then once you define what is very interestingly called as a TOM, or target operating model, you figure this out, and then you have all of the org and people implications right after that, right? Then you say, what are your lines and boxes going to look like? And lines and boxes is a loose word we use for org structure, right? What are your spans and layers? Spans and layers are something which is basically how many people does uh, how many people report into one person. That's typically the span of control. So for example, in the
Mhm.
case of a CEO, there are some magic numbers around 8 to 12, 8 to 14, and
Right.
things like that, depending on the industry. Layers are the number of layers, you reporting layers do you have in the organization. And I think intuitively a lot of us know that, like companies in the financial services or in the tech, the pyramids are typically shorter. They're
Sure.
wider, but they're shorter. Whereas in manufacturing, it's really tall, right? Like there are people, there's also blue collar workers in manufacturing, not just white collar. So for this organization, we were trying to figure out a few things, right? If we want to deliver a project in an agile methodology, which means a typical scrum team is nothing but a multifunctional team, right? You'll have your developers, testers, your scrum masters, your quality engineers, your business analysts. But that is from a project standpoint, a delivery standpoint. But from an org structure, from a reporting line standpoint, how do we want to structure them? And
Mhm.
irrespective of how we structure them, how do we enable them to work in that Scrum methodology, right? And that's
Mhm.
when we sort of looked at a concept called homes and missions, which is a very common concept in consulting as well, actually,
Mhm.
where a lot of consulting organizations are set up as homes. So home by homes, I mean like I sit within people consulting, for example. Someone would sit within tech consulting, for example. Someone would sit within business consulting. So these are our homes. Homes are where people sit together, learn their craft, upskill themselves. They do the similar kind of work. But missions are your projects where you get deployed on cross functional projects. You bring your expertise together and then you sort of deliver on a common goal, right? So we sort of established these homes and missions for them. We said, okay, similar homogeneous skills should sit
Mhm.
within the similar team. That enables things around upskilling, that enables things around career progression as well, right? From a
Mhm.
junior developer to a senior developer. How do we do that, right? And these people would be working on projects where they may not work with a senior developer or a principal developer, but how do you enable them to move in this sort of a career path? We
Mhm.
did that for them. We sort of designed what is the right workforce size for them, which is very important for a lot of organizations now, because no one wants to be overstaffed and overcapacitated, right? Everyone is looking at costs. So how do you size these organizations? And it's not a simple unitary method to say, oh, 1 billion revenue would mean X number of employees, that many billion would mean that many employees, right? So it's very interesting. And there are lots of layers to it, right? There are different ways to size different functions. So finance sizing would be very different from a business facing function like, say, sales. So we did that. We built out an offshoring strategy for them. They were also looking at um, how do we offshore some bit of our transactional work, thereby making saving more cost, right? And the
Mhm.
aspect around how do you even define what is that transactional work? What are the guiding principles to say something could be offshored and not sit in your area of operations, right?
Right.
Typically things which don't have a statutory impact, typically things which are low risk, typically things that are high volume. These bits, right? So yeah, we did this. It was a nice 3 month long design project only, but then after that there was nearly 4 months of implementation, because bringing it to life was the tricky part. Designing all of this on fancy slide decks was was really easy, honestly, but activating it, and in the UK specifically, there are very different norms around how you manage such transformations, where it could have a people impact in terms of redundancies. So there are councils in not just UK, in the whole of Europe actually, that protect workers' rights, including white collar workers. So how do you navigate that? How do you manage that? We typically would then get employee relations kind of people in to sort of advise us on what's the right move. Do you want to do it in tranches? How do you activate the savings? When do you realize the savings? And how do you sort of reorganize your savings to be put back into the business? So that was the kind of work we did for
Okay.
this specific client.
Hmm. I'll take you back to transition into consulting from MBA, right? And you spoke about transferable skills, right? So, uh, tell us, how did you actually kind of, while you were getting into consulting, how did you convince them, and what kind of transferable skills pitch you had?
Yeah. I think one big one for me was definitely stakeholder management. During my days as an engineer in Singapore, I was typically on a secondment in a client team, in their quality team, on their commissioning team, which meant I was the only one from my company in that entire client's
Mhm.
office. And I pretty much work like their own employee, just that I'm on a payroll for someone else. And I had a reporting manager there. So my day to day stuff is getting managed by people who are not even in my company. And that kind of influencing is very different, right? Because we all know how to manage our reporting managers, how we know how to manage our teams. But these are people who are not influencing your career path
Hmm.
directly. Indirectly they massively are, but not directly, right? They're not the ones who are giving you the performance rating. So I think that stakeholder management, that is one skill which I feel is very transferable across industries, right? And I
Hmm.
played very heavily on it to say that I did a good job. We landed an extension. They wanted to keep me for longer. It's just that interpersonal effectiveness that you create with someone. And that's as important as it is in engineering. It is the same thing in consulting, right? In consulting, you want to be a true advisor to a client. You
Mhm.
just don't want to be a vendor where you're going to sell 10 things and you make some money off of selling things, because clients are smart. They know that that's not the real value add. So how do you create that really raw human relationship to say, I'm here, I'm of course going to have my personal agenda, personal benefits when I sell to you, but then I also want to add value to your organization. I want to solve for your problems. And a lot
Hmm.
of times these relationships are not instantaneous, right? You sort of nurture them over years and years, and then you sort of
Right.
crack and you land a good project. So I
Hmm.
think stakeholder management was one. The other one was problem solving and critical thinking, right? I think of them very closely associated because I came from an engineering background. It sort of just is ingrained in me to break problems in a logical sequence, in a logical order, into the smallest size possible, and then work across it, right? And to build that critical thinking around, if A then B and then how C, right? I think it's just simple ways of reasoning, simple ways of argumenting, right? To say, do you understand the logic? Do you understand the connectivity? And that's probably why a lot of consulting firms run these psychometric assessments where they make candidates do their numerical and logical reasoning tests. And you think that's really silly because that's what people would do during their SATs and whatnot. But that's really what they're looking for, right? That can you
Hmm.
spot the trend? And it's not important. It's irrespective of the trend you find. It's about, can you spot a pattern? Can you spot a trend? Can you spot anomalies in a story, right? So
Right.
these things were very important. I heavily played on my sectoral focus in the manufacturing sector as well, as someone who knows the details, as someone who's worked, as someone who knows the processes. That was really helpful in my case. Another thing that was very helpful was because I'd had an international education paired with working abroad. at that time in India, that was really valued, to say you'll bring that new perspective, at least in terms of ways of working, if not delivering directly to a client, but how people operate across the globe versus how people operate in India, right? So I think I played on few of those things, which seemed to work in my favor.
Interesting. So when typically I coach people to answer the question of why should we hire you, we use a model of kind of a hard skill or a spike, then soft and the overlap, right? So you
Okay.
can see that in your value proposition, you played on all of them very, very well, right? So your sectorial experience is your hard skill, right? So you spoke about you have
Hmm.
a good knowledge on that. You spoke
Hmm.
about you being very good at handling stakeholders, which is like a very, very good consulting soft skill.
Hmm.
And at the same time, you also spoke about you being a good problem solver, right? So what consultants
Hmm.
already are doing, right? So you had a probably a very, very complete pitch. When you told me.
I must admit, I didn't prepare for it.
So next question was about your experience of landing into consulting, right? So I think you spoke about you already having some conversation on the campus or even before that with your friends who are in consulting in Singapore and other markets, right? So you had an image of what consulting is, right? And then here you are in consulting at some point of time. So how was your landing experience in terms of how quickly you got adjusted? Or another thing that I would love to know is your impression of consulting and the reality of consulting. Did that resonate 100%, or what are some of the things that you found out, okay, this was just a myth or this was just something that people talk about, but in real life consulting, that's not true.
Yeah. So I would classify mine as a crash landing experience because of the way I mentioned to you how Hay Group was getting acquired by Conferry. And so there was just a lot of volatility in the organization that I ended up being in. And I remember when, at the time when my friends would talk about consulting, a big part is the glamour around traveling business class, living in fancy hotels, going to these companies, board meetings, and you are talking really high level stuff. And here I am, and my first, it wasn't even a project, it was an assignment. So because I remember I was still on the bench, and I would keep pestering the staffing manager to say, just give me something, just give me, there's no work which is too low, and all of that things that you say. And then a senior member of the team sent me a deck, and they said, can you change the formatting? The template needs to be moved from this client's old template to client's new template. And I'm just looking at them, and I'm like, I didn't do my MBA for this. Because you come with a mindset, and you're like, no, as consultants, you're doing, in consulting, we call it the sexy work, right? And I'm like, this, what am I doing? I'm formatting slides. And I did it with that arrogance to say, what is this? This is such menial work. And my work was ripped apart, because that's when I learned in consulting things was detail, attention to detail was so important. Like, I'll give you an example. That deck had four shades of blue, and the
Mhm.
partner picked on, and they're like, and actually this was not even a partner, they were a principal, so even they picked on things like, Kriti, the blue on slide 2 is not the shade as the blue on slide 6. And things like font sizes, the number of font sizes that need to float on an on a slide, right? I had so many going on, and having animation and whatnot, the color themes. And I was like, and that's when it hit me that I thought this work is really simple, and I was being the princess to say I'm not going to do this work, but I couldn't even do that because I had so many faults in that. Then my next assignment was, again, I was just supporting someone who was short on time, and they were like, can you help me write a job description for this in this role? And I'm like, okay, I'll just Google and put some things, etc. I did, and I knew a little, and because it was manufacturing, I knew manufacturing, so I could put a few bullets here and there. While the content all made sense, but the review that I got back on my work was very interesting, and which I
Mhm.
do till date now. They had done simple things, Gaurav, but so impactful, right? They kept my content, they retained my content, they structured it very differently. So they started with big picture, they started with strategy stuff, then operational, then development. And I'm like, and as a young consultant, you're like, wow, that's where the impact comes from, right? You learn these small things. So it was crash landing of sorts. I didn't get onto a project for a very long time, and I was just getting very irritable to say I'm here to learn something and everything. uh, Two of my colleagues were working on this proprietary tool that Conferry owns, and I was very fascinated by that tool. It's called the job evaluation tool,
Mm.
and basis which it's an IP actually, basis which, and it dates back to 1970s, I think, where you are able to size a role basis an algorithm that they've put together, right? And then you can compare roles and say which is a more complex role and why is it complex, and different roles could be complex for different reasons. So it was very logical and there was numbers behind it. You put up an equation. So again, the engineer in me was very excited. And since I was on no project and I heard two of my colleagues were doing this, and one fine day I just told them, and I was like, that you're going to be in that meeting room. Can I just be a fly on the wall? Because I knew this client is not a confidential client, so I knew this work is happening, and I could participate. I said, I'll just be a fly on the wall. I want to hear the kind of conversations you have when you understand a role. And
Mm.
that's where it was so beautiful. They put me in for 3 sessions. They just said, you can't interrupt our thought, our process flow and our thoughts. Just
Correct.
you do whatever you want, but you just don't disturb us. And it was so fascinating, Gaurav, because suddenly in my head I was like, oh, a role. Okay, let's say there is a role of a sales manager. Simple, a
Mm.
sales manager is supposed to go sell in their territory, right? And then you just put up an equation. But absolutely not. They were talking about contours. They're talking about the freedom of to act for that role, the kind of thinking the role brings. Is it very novel thinking or is it very structured thinking? It's like saying, when you sell, again going back to Colgate versus the electricity example, selling Colgate, which is a day-to-day use product, is far easier than selling something which is as nuanced as electricity, right? So a
Mm.
sales manager for the two is vastly different then, vastly different skill sets. So,
Absolutely.
so it was very fascinating, and that's how I figured how that tool worked. And my first project in the pharmaceutical sector was around that tool, and it worked very well. I knew pharmaceutical sector. It was around the understanding of the tool which I had built just by being in office, by talking to people, and so it was just a little easier than it would have been.
Mm.
But yeah, that was my crash landing story. And I remember I used to walk up to partners and I'm like, I don't have much to do. I'm just doing proposals. Can you put me on something? And they were like, just wait, Kriti. You'll never get this time again. Once you're a consultant, you'll cry for this time. So just relax. And that really is true, because when you're in deep in some projects, you're just so time poor that you're waiting for that downtime to happen.
Absolutely.
But when that downtime comes, you really, really appreciate it.
Mm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Great.
I
Great.
think
So,
another feature
uh,
was I want to talk about this. Like, when you come into consulting, you come from B schools, and in my case, I'd worked for a few years, so you feel like you're really smart. You're the smartest one in the room. You have that wrong notion about yourself,
mm.
and you go into these meetings, you meet senior leaders, and
Mm.
you're proved wrong in a very different way, right? Because and they're very polite about it, but
Yeah.
you realize that there's just so much for you to learn. uh, Sometimes it also, you come in young, you have that young blood, and you're like, I want to go for the senior meeting. And I remember in a lot of cases the clients would be like, we need a senior partner to accompany a junior consultant as well. And it would hit you as a young consultant, but then you realize it's not so much the age, it's more the experience and the nuance of holding that
Absolutely.
conversation, right? Having been
Mm.
in those discussions. I'd gone once with this very fiery female partner, and we'd gone for a discussion, and it was again a family owned business. The owner sort of made a remark saying, madam, how would you know about our business? We run this, I know the problems. You don't do this for a living, so how will you be able to fix my problems? And that partner made such a beautiful statement. She said, doctors don't need to be diagnosed with a disease to help their patients, right? So it's much like that. Us consultants don't need to go through it, but we have the right skill sets to diagnose, to understand. And that stuck with me, right? It's about giving them that comfort. And in that moment, that man who's 70 plus and he's talking to a partner who's probably in mid 40s, age didn't matter. It was
Mm.
that trust, it was that comfort, it was that confidence, right? That I have done this before for clients. I know, of course, your context is vastly different, but I know what I'm doing and what I'm saying, right? So it goes back to that stakeholder management influencing kind of bit, right? Like how do you give them that comfort? It's a lot around that, right, Gaurav? At the end of the day, the market is small. A lot of consulting firms are fighting for the same projects. We are nearly similar in terms of our solution areas, but the ones who win are the ones who have those relationships.
Absolutely. I think relationship, this is a completely relationship-based business. Um, we touched upon the work-life balance, and you also spoke about that. I still remember the word that you used, that the mother or motherly guilt, right? When kids are at home and you are traveling or you are doing your work. So I just want you to probably go back in that shoes, right? Because um, we see a lot of consulting aspirants, females, right? Have this in mind that how is it going to go, whether it's going to be a very short career, which I'll have to probably, kind of cut short. And when I have family,
Hmm.
so many questions, right? So, how would you, what would you advise them, right?
Hmm.
What are some of the insights that you have drawn out of, your 7, 8 years of consulting life, kind of managing work life, family, and what's the advice, especially to female consultants or female consulting aspirants?
Mhm. If I reflect back, right, Gaurav, I think one thing that worked very well in my favor, by the time I had conceived, I'd already been in the firm for nearly 3+ ish years. Uh, I knew the people in the firm knew that I provide a certain quality of work. I put in this much hard work. So when I went on my mat leave and I came back, I remember during my mat leave I'd gotten another offer from somewhere, and I was in conflict where to go, and that the other offer was a little better monetarily and everything, but I chose to come back to the same organization. And I feel as returning moms, just the moment when you come back from a mat leave, I'm not talking about a few years later, it really really helps if you come back to the same organization. Because
Hmm.
when I came back, I could put my foot down with confidence and say I'm not going to travel for a year because I'm still breastfeeding. I
Hmm.
want to be around my child. I am going to be mostly I'll also work from home 2 days a week, and the firm was perfectly fine because I'd already done my hard work. I created
The
that rapport.
credibility was established already, right?
Yes,
Hmm.
because and I'm not saying that you can't do this with the newer if you were to join a new firm, but it's just a little harder. So
Hmm.
in my opinion, that worked really well. I remember I would there were days that were dedicated that I would not step out for a meeting, etc. And everyone was perfectly fine with it. It was a lot in my head as well. I kept feeling I'm putting it on people, I'm throwing my tantrums. But there was this very senior male leader, very interesting, and he's like, "No, Kriti, you're not putting up any tantrums. It's biological. We don't understand it as much because our bodies don't go through it. We are not the ones who are primary caregiver for a child, especially in the first few years. So it's perfectly fine." And he also said something
Wow.
very beautiful. He said, a lot of times we may not it's not that we are not saying it because we don't want to give you that flexibility. A lot of times it doesn't even occur to us. So
Hmm.
just ask or demand. And in my case, a lot of times I would just demand, and it was perfectly fine. I think a lot of us also fear to ask, and it's very very normal, right? And I think I've learned that I luckily had very good leaders back in Conferry then who were very supportive of this entire thing. One thing which played very heavily in my favor was I returned from mat leave, and 8 months after that, the entire world was in a lockdown. So I didn't have to step out at all for good 1 year. And then India had like multiple lockdowns. So we call it a blessing in disguise for us because we saw
Excellent.
all of our child's milestones of first word, first walk, first tooth, everything, right? So it
Hmm.
was, and it had its own downside because after that, when we started going to work once a day, once a week, twice a week, a child didn't know that parents could also go out of the house, leaving him at home with grandparents. And for him, it was a very weird concept that parents go out. But yeah, Coming back, I think the pandemic really helped us. But just ask. I think it's very important to ask. A lot of us don't ask. A lot of these consulting organizations are very forward thinking in terms of their DE&I policies as well. The only downside, Gaurav, is some clients may not be
Mhm.
in certain parts of the world, certain types of clients. But know that your teams, your senior leaderships, they would be, and it's just perfect to take them in confidence, right? To do it. Like I was very paranoid when I realized I'm pregnant, and typically in India you wouldn't talk about it very soon and stuff until you start showing. And I didn't want to tell the leadership, thinking, oh, because I was due for a promotion by the way then, and I was very worried, what if
Oh.
they don't promote me? They hold on to my promotion, and I think in my sixth or seventh month, the promotion came through. So I was promoted just before I left for my mat leave. So it
Mm.
was also that confidence the firm gives you, right? That you're being awarded on the basis of your merit, and there are certain biological processes that work by virtue of which you get that maternity leave, etc. You could get flexible hours depending on, and everyone's situation could be different.
Mm.
But yeah, yeah, just ask, just demand. Not even ask, just demand, because it's your right. In all honesty, as a woman, simple things. I was still. Expressing milk in the office because I used to be I was an exclusively, I had an exclusive breastfed child. So I had time slots blocked for a meeting room to use that meeting room during those hours. And I remember there've been senior people in those rooms, and I've asked them to leave because that was the only room where I could do it. And I was like, and they're perfectly fine with it. But before that, no one even knew that happens, right? And
Mm.
you just have to say it, I think.
Mm. That's so true, right? So you need to ask, and you need to, and that confidence, right? That you are adding value, you are giving your best, right? So,
It's very tough though, Gaurav. I say it now, it's been like 6, 7 years now, but in that moment, it's very tough. And especially Indra Nui said this, right? Women's biological clocks don't align with our career clocks, right? You'll typically have a baby much early in your career, right? When you've still not reached that level to demand. But I think
mm,
you it's and it's don't think of it as like we deserve it and it's our birthright or something, but it is our uh, it is a right within an employer's space to give women that space, to give us that break, right? So
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that advice. I'm sure it'll help a lot of consultants and consulting aspirants. Thanks a lot. Moving on to another aspect altogether, right? So you have worked in India in consulting. You have also done Middle Eastern projects, and now you are in Europe. Okay.
hmm,
So yes, I think you touched upon work-life balance and some other considerations from an internal perspective. What's your experience on uh, the type of project or the type of clients? Have you seen difference? I mean, let's say if I take a similar kind of project that you did in India versus Middle East,
hmm,
in UK or in Europe, yeah.
hmm.
Do you see differences between the geographies and cultures?
Absolutely. So in India, across the two firms that I worked in, one of the biggest chunks of revenue would typically come from family owned businesses slash promoter driven organizations. These could be the likes of Reliance, Adani, those are the big houses. And then you have a lot of medium to small houses as well, right? A lot of projects are done with them, and they're very different in their ways of working. Remember, they are, while they're not operating at an MNC level, but these are typically organizations where the second generation or third generations are running the businesses. They have probably studied at an Oxford, Cambridge, Stanford, something. They come with those really interesting global thoughts, and they have very, very deep pockets. And that's probably why they buy these consulting services in bulk, right? The way they operate is very different. They have very this thought again, the bit around the electricity versus Colgate, right? They have very crazy thoughts around how they want to do things. So you end up doing very, very dynamically new stuff in India from this promoter lens, right? The way of delivering it is a little bit challenging because some of these organizations are quite bureaucratic, much like government offices in India as well, or government offices anywhere across the world for that matter. But they give you a lot of freedom to think of your solution. They don't want a templatized answer. They prefer not having a templatized answer. They want to do something new. Barring a few organizations who are very clear, they would actually tell you, our competitor ABC has done this. Can you do the same for us? And then you come do the run the same thing, right? But the novelty of these ideas really makes you think, how do
Mm.
you want to go about it, how do you want to deliver. Stakeholder management in India is very, very different, right? It's also very open ended. So sometimes a client is saying they want to solve for a certain problem, you agree on a scope contractually, but then the scope keeps changing quite a lot. That's just how these contracts are set up in India, right? So I think you get to do a lot more variety of work, and as consultants you don't get boxed into one thing. So like, imagine I'm in org consulting, and we spoke about it, there are multiple parts of it. There's leadership development, there is assessments, competencies, workforce development, whatnot. You don't get boxed very easily in India because they feel if I come to a Kriti for something, Kriti should be able to solve for most of my challenges, right? That's just how,
Mm.
that's how we behave at an interpersonal level in India. So I thought that was a very big positive for me in my early days, because I was spoiled for choices in terms of the kind of experiences as I got, in terms of me picking a specialization within my own niche, right? So that was very interesting. Middle East was very different. Middle East, again, very, very deep pockets, very deep pockets, very professional in terms of their approach. And they're very heavily reliant on consultants to bring the best practices. In India, a lot of the clients will also impose their thoughts onto you or influence you. In the Middle East, they really look out for consultants to say, and this is of course 5 years back, and Middle East has evolved a lot in the last 5 years, I have to admit. So maybe it's changed a little, but my learning was that they really look forward to hearing, getting challenged by consultants. They love doing that. And because Middle East in general is a global melting pot, there are people from different parts of the world, so they accept a lot of these different opinions very, very openly. So that was quite a shift from how India operated versus Middle East.
Mhm.
UK is a whole different ball game, right? Now, UK has, in the UK, you get you they look for deep specialism. They prefer, typically, at least in people consulting, there are some of us who are T-shaped learners, right? So we know the broad learning and we have our deep specialisms as well. Clients typically like that deep specialism because a lot of things, especially around people consulting, like I said, around workers councils, etc., are very typical to this part of the world. So they want deep specialism, so that they are sort of managing all of their risks and mitigating everything that they foresee coming their way, right? um, Contracts are very tightly guarded in, from my experience in the UK. Scope creep is a thing. Like in India, we never had something called a scope creep, whereas in the UK, if there is something that you're doing different from your contract, there's typically a change order that's floated across to the client, etc.
Right.
um, I remember my first week in the UK, and someone said, "You've just come from India, so don't remember, do not ping anyone in the UK after 4 p.m. on a Friday for any work." So people guard their work-life balance very closely because there's so much emphasis on doing other things in life as well. So they will work, they want to put in good work, but they also they create their boundaries really well, which I quite appreciate. And now if you see my average diary, I have my calendar, office calendar, blocked for a morning school run, afternoon school run, you book in a yoga class, you book in something else, you have a trip to attend to, anything. But as long as you've planned it in your day and you'll deliver your expected quantum of work, everything else is fine. So
Mm.
yeah, so UK is quite structured in that sense. Europe on the whole is very different as well. So when I moved here, I thought, we all box UK and Europe in the same way.
Mm.
But my last summer, I was on a transformation project where I was largely working with people from Europe, from the Nordic countries, from Central Europe, as well as from Western Europe. And then you realize, even within Europe, these specific regions are so different. To work with someone from Copenhagen versus to work with someone from Germany, their way of working, their way of delivery, their way of conveying a message. And because comms are so important in consulting, irrespective of which part of the world, how do you run your communication plan, right? So it's very, very different in Europe as well, very differently nuanced than the UK. And it's very interesting. We all club UK into one, but UK also has a lot of difference, right? So north part of England works a little differently than south part in London, versus the Scots work very differently as well. So yeah, lots of different ways of working that I've been fortunate enough to see.
And that's the beauty of consulting, right? So we get a chance to speak to and work with people from so many different types of backgrounds, right? And they bring in their flavor, and some of them actually have a rub-off effect on us as well, right? Which is also the consultant's maturity curve. So amazing.
Yeah, I
So
have a colleague who was a literature major, whereas I thought most engineers would go into consulting. Consultants typically in my head was largely engineer. She's a literature major, and the way she approaches a problem versus I approach a problem is so fundamentally different. And we complement each other very well in those skills. I think the moment you start recognizing it as a complementing each other, not as a threat to you, it really adds value to the client. Then, right?
absolutely.
Very, very different backgrounds where you could learn a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I have an amazing kind of over the years, so many different profiles I have seen. I mean, when I joined McKinsey, with me in the same batch, another person joined who had a sports background. So he was
Yes.
Olympic gold medalist, right? One of my very good friend was a surgeon in the again same McKinsey
Wow.
branch. And as I started coaching, even more variety came my way. So I remember in 2016 was the first time when I coached a US Marine. And
Wow.
I mean, I was like shocked to see somebody who is a veteran want to get into McKinsey.
Wow.
And yeah, I think that's a beauty of consulting as a career, right? Unless, I mean, as long as you want to work in a structured problem-solving environment, you have an achievement orientation, right? The background doesn't work, doesn't matter, right? Because ultimately, what you need, the domain knowledge can be taught, right?
Yeah.
But the other these some of these soft skills, right? The structured way of thinking, analytical way of taking decision, top-down way of communication, those are it's something that will take a lot of time. If you
Yeah.
have this, then basically it doesn't matter whether you are from literature, whether you are from engineering.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Great, great. Uh, One question about the changes that we see in consulting as an industry, consulting as a domain, right? Now you have been consulting for almost a decade, right?
Yeah.
What you would say as like one or two main areas that you think have changed over time?
Yeah. I think the traditional partnership model, which is now only with the big fours and the MBBs of the world, that is under a lot of scrutiny, especially in this part of the world, where it was the leverage model was very high, right? There were senior partners selling project, there were junior team members delivering, and that's how you make the margins. I think that's being challenged a whole bit now, right? And with the advent of with AI bit coming in, it's just gotten a little worse, because a lot of those analytical things, deck creation, like as an entry consultant back in the days, all you would do is create fancy decks. But now there's a tool that could do it for you. Or you'd be analyzing master Excels. Now there is a tool that would build out fancy pivots, find out the patterns, and interpret data and everything, right? So I think it's that entire operating model around having that pyramid, which is pegged on a one partner leading a team. I think that is being questioned as we speak.
Mhm.
Uh, the other bit is a lot of clients, we're right now in a very, I wouldn't call it a downturn, but we are in a volatile environment when we think of economy at the moment. When the times were really good, clients were making money and they were perfectly fine to give that money, some of that money to consultants as well. Right now
Yeah.
clients are not making as much money, so they are like, why do I pay for these services? What is the real value add? Because a lot of times they end up hiring people from the market now, so they bring that talent in-house, that skill in-house, and a lot of organizations have their in-house consulting teams. Like HSBC has a Siemens has a really good team. They have their in-house transformation strategy teams that are doing a lot of what us consultants do, right? So it's also time for us to think, what is that real value add that we are bringing to the table, right? Especially when it comes to longer duration projects, because it's a cost benefit analysis. If it's something short, something where you need more insights from an outside in perspective, clients are happy to bring consultants because we have that knowledge. Whereas if it's something longish, more around implementation, change management, they typically want people to be in-house
Mm.
to run that show. I know a lot of firms are pivoting around the managed service model as well. So now consulting is being sold as a managed service, which
Service.
is yeah, which is quite an interesting pivot. That's how IT services were being sold a few years, or are still being sold, right? So I think we're going to see a few more pivots around how we truly add value as consultants. But yeah, it's going to be a few rocky years for consulting. I think generally the knowledge sector, given AI, etc. It's a very good time for people who are coming fresh into consulting to bring that thought process, right? A lot of us would suffer from having been in the industry for a while, doing things the same way. So it'll be very interesting to see new people come and challenge to say, we could do
Mm.
the same thing with lesser effort, or we put in more effort and we have a bigger impact. So I think a lot of that thinking is going to happen in the few years.
Yeah, it will be a test of your own career change management, right? As the changing, can you adapt to it. Another thing that we also see is now a lot of even frontline consulting, MBBs and even Big Fours are recruiting consultants on contract rather
Mhm.
than on payroll, right? So overall, that commitment or that investment, that appetite has gone down. Of course, some of it is a function of a downturn, no doubt about
Yeah.
it. Advisory, or be it consulting or any other advisory, discretionary spends, very easy to get rid of them
Yes.
when the corporates are in downturn. But yeah, but they
Yeah.
also bounce back. The history has told us that they'll bounce back. Yeah, absolutely. Great. Last question before we end the conversation. If you have to give one advice to consulting aspirant at this point of time, what would be your advice?
I think it's about we all try to become that successful profile that a McKinsey, Bain, BCG would hire, and we try to put ourselves in a box. And I
Mm,
think consulting firms hate that. I've learned over the years, like when I hire, if someone is thinking the standard way of how my other junior team members are thinking, then I'm not very excited by it. I'm more excited if someone is slightly different in their
mm,
style of thinking, in this way of working. So I think create a box that fits you. That's really really important, and that's been the case in the last 4 or 5 years, right? With a lot of awareness around neurodiversity, we're also seeing that a lot of people who are not neurotypical, the
mm,
way they work and the way they operate, it's amazing. So I'm very neurotypical, and I used to struggle with people who were not like me when I would work with them. But now over the years, I find the kind of value they add. Like, I am a proper converger, right? I like to converge on things, action, get done. And when I would work with divergers, they jump from one thought to another and another. The value that brings, because you've probably not thought of all of those options that you could offer to a client, right? So
absolutely.
back in the days, there was a consultant mindset, a consultant profile, and we would do these psychometric assessments, and they had a success profile, they would match you against it, and that's it, it's a match, right? But now I feel I'm seeing a lot of value in people who are the different backgrounds, who think differently, who operate differently. So I feel if someone wants to get in, apart from focusing on all of the stuff around transferable skills, domain knowledge, and everything, all of those things being constant, build that USP for yourself, right? What is it that you do differently? How do you think differently? So even in your, and if you're especially coming in as a lateral hire, if you feel that there are certain experiences which are very different from typical people who moved into lateral roles, I would be very keen on hearing more stories around that and how they can bring it to the consulting world.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with you on this. I think over the last 5, 6 years, even I have seen as a coach when I get a feedback from my candidates and some of my senior mentees who are now interviewers, that the focus is now on differentiation, the uniqueness, right? So they don't want, another Gaurav or another Kriti, right? They have it
Exactly.
already, right? Now that uniqueness needs to be preserved. You can't give them, I mean, the way client doesn't want a cookie cut answers, right? The consulting companies don't want a very robotic candidate, right? They
Exactly.
want personalities. They want that uniqueness. Absolutely. Great, great. Thanks, Kriti. Thanks for being here, spending so much time and being candid, sharing so many insights with us. Thanks a lot. We'll of course be in touch. Great to have you also on the WhatsApp group.
I hope I could help a few people with my story. That's the agenda, really.
And that's a wrap on today's episode of Unfiltered. I hope you liked it. Thanks a lot for tuning in. If you have liked the content, please press like button, subscribe to this podcast, and also share it in your network. And please do comment with your point of views, because we would love to understand your feedback so that we can improve and get you better episodes as we go forward. Also, special thanks to today's guest for dropping so many value bombs candidly and very openly. Last but not the least, if you are someone who is working in consulting or a consulting aspirant, do not forget to join Being Consultants WhatsApp community. It is the world's biggest community with more than 2,000 community members from 40 plus different countries helping out each other in their consulting journey. So until I see you next, keep cracking.